She reshuffled her ratings on U.S. Steel and Nucor. Give us a sense here of why you would favor one over the other, Timna.
Yeah, sure. So we've been broadly negative on the group now for a while, pointing out grid challenging issues related to oversupply that we expect to manifest in the second half of the year. We've never seen in several decades of covering the group this much new capacity hitting the market. So overarching cautious view on the group. But within that, looking at the pullback that we've seen, we thought Nucor looked a bit more interesting. They do have more exposure to infrastructure where we see some offsets with stronger demand, of course, several government initiatives there.
Uh-huh.
And in the case of U.S. Steel, just falling prices both for tubular and for Europe, which are particular to their operation.
I am curious that when we talk about prices, and I know they've been moderating, but is the idea here that there is a material decline below, I guess, the mean, or is this just kind of the reversion to the mean? Because I know prices have gotten a little bit ahead of themselves to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's accurate. The last several years have been quite a yo-yo. You had a spike in 2021 when everything ran up. Then in 2022, you had a spike related to Russia invading Ukraine, which was material for raw material costs. This year was just a crazy yo-yo as well. But our view is that we're going to go below historical average profitability because of this glut of new supply that I've identified in our research. So that's a cautionary tone. But I don't think that people are quite aware that the printed prices right now are probably at least $200 exaggerated of what's happening in the real market.
Oh, wow. And why do you think there is such a disparity there?
What this happens when prices correct is that the mills are slow to lower prices, but they just offer big discounts. And so it starts to trickle into the lower price on a lag.
Mm-hmm.
It's also something we call a buyer's strike. So buyers like to buy less in a declining price environment. But we're also heading into a slower period of the year, typically in the second half.
I am curious. You mentioned the idea of supply, and I want to draw a parallel here because there's been a lot of talk over the last couple of years about, I guess, some of the discipline that we saw when it comes to energy producers. The idea that when they had a chance to increase output, they kind of held pat, and investors really did reward a lot of those companies. And I'm wondering if there is any possibility we could see that same type of discipline with some of the steel makers.
I'd say I'm not that optimistic because it's one thing not to take energy out of the ground. It's still there, right? It's like a mining company. If you have coal or if you have an asset in the ground, you can always put it off and extract it later. But in the case of steel or aluminum, you've got the asset in place. If it's not running, you're losing money. So it's a bit different. And we're not really optimistic about discipline. I think there's some mills that are a little more disciplined in their approach than others. But at the end of the day, you're fighting imports at some level. So if you don't produce enough, then it's going to come from somewhere. So I think it's harder than on the energy example you gave.
When we talk about some here in the U.S. at least, some of the import restrictions and what that has done in terms of helping to aid the industry, is there any sense here, I guess, A, that those tariffs will remain, and B, do you actually expect any sort of change in those tariffs?
The tariffs definitely helped the industry. Section 232 was put in place by President Trump back in February 2018. And they weren't removed, even though this is an unprecedented example of protecting an industry that was doing just fine, in our view at least. Certainly protects against some of the very discounted prices out there. In our view, what's going to happen is over time, that's going to be converted into some sort of carbon border adjustment mechanism, so a tax. Makes perfect sense, and it can be a green pretext and can be explicable that way. So I think that'll happen later this decade.